They never made it far. 2 weeks into their flight, they found themselves in a border town, half rotting wood, half sun-bleached stone, where no one asked questions as long as you paid in cash. Eli rented a room above a saloon, the kind where the walls were so thin you could hear every whisper in the hallway. He told her it was temporary, but days turned into weeks, and still they stayed. The saloon smelled of smoke and cheap whiskey, its floors worn smooth by boots that had carried men from one trouble to the next. She began to recognize the faces: card players with quick hands, women with painted lips, drifters who spoke too softly to be trusted. It was a place where names didn't matter, and that was exactly why Eli had chosen it. One night, while Eli was downstairs, she overheard 2 men talking in the hallway. They spoke of a killing. Not in their town, but not far. A man shot dead in his own doorway, his wife saying the killer had pale eyes. The description was too close, the timing too perfect. She pressed her ear to the wall, her pulse steady, almost calm. By now, shock was a stranger to her. When Eli came back up, she didn't mention it. She poured him a drink instead, her hands steady, her face unreadable. Somewhere deep inside, she realized she had crossed a line. Not in what she had done, but in what she was willing to ignore. Months later, a letter arrived for her. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. It held only one sentence, written in a hand she knew too well. "I know who he is. I know what he did to Thomas." There was no signature. She burned it in the oil lamp before Eli returned. She could have left then. Could have taken the few coins she'd hidden in her sewing kit, walked to the station, and disappeared. But she didn't, because by then the truth was no longer just his. It was hers too. And so she stayed, bound not by love alone, and not by fear alone, but by something far more dangerous. The knowledge that once you have lived beside a monster long enough, you begin to wonder if you've become one yourself. The breaking point came in the spring of 1917. The snow had melted, the river was running high, and the roads were soft enough to swallow a wagon wheel. It was on one of those roads that Eli disappeared for 3 days without a word. When he came back, his knuckles were split, his shirt torn, and there was a strange glint in his eyes, something that wasn't relief or exhaustion, but a quiet certainty. That night, he told her to pack a small bag. "Just the essentials," he said, "and nothing more." She asked where they were going, but he only answered, "Away from here." She didn't argue. The truth was, she'd been expecting this, had felt it creeping toward them for months, the way a storm gathers before the first strike of lightning. They left before dawn, their wagon creaking along the river road. She looked back once at the valley, at the church spire just visible over the trees, and thought about the grave that held her brother. She realized then that she had never truly mourned him, not in the way she should have. His death had been swallowed by the life she'd chosen after, a life bound to the man who had taken him. On the second night, they camped in a hollow beside a stand of pines. Eli built a small fire, his movements deliberate, as if each spark was a thing he could control. He told her they might not be able to go back, that people were asking questions, that men were looking for him. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. In the glow of the fire, she studied his face. The hard lines, the faint scars, the eyes that had seen more endings than beginnings. She realized she no longer knew if she was staying with him because she loved him, or because she had become too much like him. When the fire burned low, Eli reached for her hand. His palm was rough, his grip unyielding. "Whatever happens," he said, "we don't speak of the past, not to anyone." And she nodded, because in that moment, she understood the truth in its entirety. The past was no longer something behind them. It was the ground they were standing on, and it would follow them wherever they went. The 5th year brought a thaw, but not just in the land. Something in Eli shifted, though whether it was softening or sharpening she couldn't tell. He spoke more often, told her things she hadn't asked to hear, names, places, scraps of memory that felt like confessions, but carried no apology. One night, as the lantern burned low, he told her exactly what happened the day Thomas died. His voice was calm, almost measured, as if he were reciting a passage from a book. He said Thomas had insulted him, spit in the dirt between them, and reached for his rifle. Eli claimed he didn't think, didn't aim. He just fired. The bullet struck Thomas in the chest and he fell without a sound. Eli said the silence afterward was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. She listened without speaking, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she asked him one question. "Did you regret it?" He looked at her for a long time, those Winter River eyes unblinking, and said, "No, but I regret what it did to you." Then he turned away, leaving her with words that felt like both a wound and a gift. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? From that night on, she found herself caught between two truths, the one where Eli was a murderer who had stolen her brother's life, and the one where Eli was the only person who understood her loneliness. They were truths that couldn't exist together, yet somehow they did, binding her tighter to him. But the valley didn't forget. A new sheriff came to town, a man younger, sharper, less willing to look the other way. He had questions about Eli's past, questions Eli never answered. She began to notice strangers watching their house from the road, men who didn't stay at the inn and didn't stop to buy supplies. Eli noticed too. His hand went to the rifle more often. Then there were the nights when he didn't come home until the sky was turning pale, his coat damp with dew, his boots caked with mud. She didn't ask where he'd been. She knew the truth would be worse than her imagination. By then, it wasn't just a marriage, it was an unspoken pact. She wouldn't betray his secrets, and he wouldn't leave her alone in the dark. By the 4th year, the whispers in town had changed. People no longer spoke of the killing, at least not directly. They spoke instead of the way Eli's shadow seemed to stretch longer than any man's, how his name made conversations falter, how even the sheriff avoided his gaze. Fear had a way of settling into a place, like damp in the walls. It didn't matter if you painted over it, it still seeped through. She had learned to live with it, or at least pretend she had. When she walked beside Eli at the market, she smiled when spoken to, bartered for flour and coffee, and carried the goods home in silence. Behind closed doors, their life was quiet, but not peaceful. Two people orbiting each other, each waiting for the other to speak first. It was around then she started to hear things from beyond the valley. Travelers passing through spoke of a man who fit Eli's description, tall, broad-shouldered, with pale eyes, who had been seen in towns where bad things had happened. A farmhand found beaten in his sleep. A gambler who vanished after a card game. A merchant robbed on a mountain road. She never asked Eli about it, but the more she listened, the more the stories sounded less like rumors and more like a map tracing his footsteps. One evening, while mending a tear in his coat, she found something in the lining, a folded scrap of paper, stiff with dried blood. On it was nothing but a name she didn't recognize, written in a hand that wasn't his. She put it back without a word. That night, she lay awake, wondering if it was a name he was meant to remember, or one he was meant to forget. And yet, even as suspicion settled deeper into her bones, she couldn't leave. She told herself it was because there was nowhere to go, no family left to take her in, no money of her own. But there was another reason, one she barely dared to think about. She didn't want to live in a world where Eli Ward didn't know her name. Because here's the secret no one wants to admit. Once you've lived beside danger long enough, the idea of safety feels strange, almost unbearable, and in the quiet of that house, surrounded by the echoes of the past, she had started to mistake the chill of fear for the warmth of love. Winter came early in the 3rd year of their marriage, and with it a kind of quiet that felt heavier than snow. The valley seemed smaller when the river froze over, the mountains crowding closer, the sky lower and darker. Inside the house, the air was thick with the scent of burning pine and the kind of silence that no crackling fire could warm. It was during that winter she began to notice the changes, not in Eli, but in herself. She no longer dreamed of Thomas in the way she once had. His face was fading, his voice a little harder to recall, as though the grave was pulling him deeper. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night and find herself turned toward Eli, her breath moving in rhythm with his. The thought would make her sit up, clutching the blanket, her heart hammering. Not because she feared him, but because she feared she was forgetting why she should. Eli never spoke of the killing, but sometimes he would tell her about the places he had been before he came to the valley. Lonely mining camps, half-built rail towns, river barges where men drank themselves blind. His voice was low and steady, the voice of someone who had seen too much to be shocked by anything. She wondered more than once how many graves his path had crossed. One night, when the wind was pushing against the shutters, he told her something that made her hands go cold. "Thomas wasn't the first," he said, without looking at her. "And he wasn't the last." Then he fell silent, letting the words settle like ash. She didn't ask what he meant. She knew better than to ask. Still, she found herself watching him more closely. The way he scanned the faces in town, the way he kept his back to the wall in the tavern, the way his right hand sometimes twitched, as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. She began to think of him not just as the man who had killed her brother, but as a man who could kill anyone. And yet there were moments, rare but real, when his touch was gentle, his voice almost kind. Those were the moments that frightened her most, because they felt like the truth. A truth she couldn't tell anyone, because no one would understand how you could love the same man you feared. They said she looked almost serene on her wedding day, as if she had finally made peace with the ghost that haunted her. But the truth was, she had simply learned how to live with it, how to keep the memory from drowning her every time she closed her eyes. The townsfolk didn't speak of it openly, but their silence was its own kind of verdict. People averted their gaze when she walked past, holding her arm through Eli's, her black dress traded for faded cream lace. Eli had moved into her late father's house, the same house where Thomas had once slept, eaten, laughed. Every creak of the wooden floors carried the memory of her brother's boots. Every nail in the wall still bore the weight of his old hunting coat. And Eli, he never asked her to take them down. He left them there, as if daring her to live inside a constant reminder. At night, she would lie in bed beside him, listening to his breathing, wondering if it sounded the same in the moments after he had pulled the trigger. She told herself it must have been an accident, that maybe her brother had drawn first, but sometimes in the stillness she would see Eli's eyes in the dark, those cold river eyes, and know, without words, that he had made his choice long before that afternoon. The years didn't soften him. Eli was not cruel in the way of men who shout and strike. His cruelty was quieter, measured in the way he watched her as she stirred the pot over the fire, in how he lingered in doorways without speaking, in the way he asked about her brother, as though testing the sharpness of a blade. He never apologized. He never explained. And perhaps that was what bound her to him, because no one else dared speak Thomas's name at all. Neighbors whispered theories. Some claimed she married him to keep from starving, that Eli's steady work and calloused hands were worth more than an old grudge. Others swore it was something dire, that she loved him, not in spite of what he had done, but because of it, that she was drawn to the danger, to the finality of a man who could take life without trembling. The truth? She carried it alone, and if you had asked her why, she might have told you the same thing she told herself each morning. There are worse things than sharing your life with a killer. The worst is being left alone with the dead. They said she wore black for 2 years after her brother's death, not because she loved him more than life itself, but because the neighbors wouldn't stop asking questions. In a town like that, grief wasn't just a burden. It was a public performance, and hers had to look convincing. But what they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was that the man she took into her bed, the man she kissed under the dim oil lamp at night, was the same man who had spilled her brother's blood into the dirt. It happened in 1912, in a corner of America where roads were still made of mud and gossip traveled faster than the mail. Her brother, Thomas, was only 21, restless and proud, always carrying his father's old rifle like a second shadow. The day he died, the air had been dry and thin, the kind that cracks the lips and makes tempers short. Some said it was a dispute over land. Others whispered about a debt that had been left unpaid too long. But there were a few, just a few, who claimed it was over something far worse. The man who killed him was named Eli Ward. He wasn't from the valley. He had drifted in from somewhere west, bringing with him the kind of silence that makes men uneasy. His eyes were the color of a winter river, cold, shifting, unreadable. When the fight broke out between him and Thomas, there were no witnesses close enough to stop it. Only the sound of one gunshot, and the sight of Thomas lying face down in the dust, his blood pooling like a shadow that wouldn't fade. Eli didn't run. He stood there as they carried the body away, his face calm, almost bored, as if death was a thing he'd seen far too often to be moved by it. The sheriff called it self-defense. No trial, no jail, just another man buried in the churchyard, another name carved into soft stone. But here's the thing history never tells you. Grief can twist in strange directions, and sometimes turn. The person you hate most in the world becomes the only person who understands what you've lost. 2 years after Thomas's burial, the same woman who wept over his grave was standing barefoot in a dim parlor, taking vows with the man who had ended his life.